Welcome to the Chapter 6 lecture on page layout. In this chapter, you will learn how to describe and apply the box model, configure margin, configure float, configure fixed relative and absolute positioning, create two-column page layouts, configure navigation in unordered lists, add interactivity to hyperlinks with pseudo-classes, and configure web pages with HTML5 structural elements, including section, article, and aside. In HTML and CSS, each element in a document is considered to be a rectangular box. This box consists of a content area surrounded by padding, border, and margin. We refer to this as the box model. In this example, the content is the text or the page element in the container. Padding is the area between the content and the border. So if you want to add some room between the edge of your container and the content, you would add padding. Border is between the padding and the margin, and it is exactly that. It is just a border around an element. And then margin determines the empty space between elements. So if you have two elements on a page and you want to add some empty space between them, you would use margin. The margin property is used to add space around or between elements. The syntax is different depending upon which margins you are trying to target. In the first example, margin 0 will apply a margin of 0 pixels to all four sides of the element, top, right, bottom, and left. The second example, margin 20 pixels, 10 pixels, will apply 20 pixels to the top and bottom and 10 pixels to the left and right. The third example will apply 10 pixels to the top, 30 pixels to the right and left, and 20 pixels to the bottom of the element. And the fourth example specifically targets all four sides with 20 pixels on top, 30 pixels on the right, 0 pixels on the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left. This might be easier to remember if you remember to read it clockwise: top, right, bottom, left. Padding is used to add space between the content and the border. The syntax is the same as it is for the margin element. So to recap, margin adds space between elements and padding adds space between the element and the border. Here's an example of the box model in action. You can see that margin is the space between the elements. In the top box, the padding is what is creating the space above and below the words examples of the box model. And margin is what is creating the space between the two boxes and above the examples box. You can see in the bottom box that it really needs some padding so it's not sitting right up against the border. The box model is the foundation of HTML and CSS, so it is important that you take the time to learn and understand this. By default, the browser uses the width and height of the content alone and then adds on the width of the border and padding, if any, which ultimately makes the element larger than the content. The box sizing property directs the browser to include the height and width for the content, plus the height and width of the padding and border. This is especially useful when trying to float items side by side and when using percentages for the height or width value. As I mentioned previously, HTML elements are essentially rectangles fitting inside of other rectangles. So it is important that you understand how big your rectangles are so you can make sure everything fits inside its container rectangle. The web page will be read from top to bottom, line by line, in the order that it appears in the HTML document. This is referred to as normal document flow. In this example, without CSS, the normal document flow is for the first box to render first and the second box to render below the first box. However, CSS can be used to move the small white box to sit inside the bigger box. It's always a good idea to take advantage of normal document flow whenever possible. If you wanted the small white box to sit above the blue box, you could position it there with CSS, or you could just move the HTML that creates the white box to above the HTML that creates the blue box, and the white box would naturally be on top because the browser reads from top to bottom. The float property is used to float elements to the right or left. In this example, the image is floated to the right. Here are the styles that were used to make that happen. The image has an ID assigned to it of #YLS, which stands for Yellow Lady Slipper. The style that is being used to make it float right is float right. Next, they added a little margin, 0 pixels on top, 0 pixels on the right, 5 pixels on the bottom, and 5 pixels on the left to add some space between the paragraph and the image. Next, they added a small 1-pixel solid black border. When you float elements, you need to clear the float to go back to the normal document flow. The styles used to clear the float are clear left, clear right, or clear both. In this instance, they used clear left since they floated the image left. The clear left style needs to apply to the element that is located where you want to stop the float. In this example, you can see what happens when the float is not cleared in the first image. The H2 tag, "Be green when enjoying wildflowers," is floating up next to the image with the text. In the second image, the float was cleared and the H2 tag reverts to normal document flow and is now located below the image. The clear left was applied to the H2 element since this is where they wanted the float to stop. The CSS display property configures how and if an element will be displayed. Display none will hide the element. Display block will render the element as a block level element even if it is actually an inline element. Display inline will display an element as inline, even if it is a block level element. And display inline block will display an element inline, but with block level capabilities. You might want to use display inline block if you are creating navigation and want to provide a larger target area for users to click on. Using display inline block will allow you to include height and width elements to make the clickable area larger. In this illustration, the image on the left is how something will display in normal document flow with everything taking up 100% of the screen. In the two-column wireframe on the right, the nav has been floated to the left, creating two columns. The HTML code on the right will generate the image on the left. The book authors chose to do a margin left on the main to get it pushed out where they wanted it, but they could have also floated the main to the left by giving it a width and floating it to the left, and then clearing the float on the footer to stop the float. Navigation is frequently coded with unordered lists. After all, a navigation menu is a list of hyperlinks or pages. The code on the left will generate the navigation on the right. The navigation is vertical or stacked because the UL and LI are block level elements. CSS can be used to remove the list markers or bullets and to remove the underline from the A tag. List style type none will remove the bullets, and text decoration none will remove the underlines from the A tags. You can make the navigation display horizontally by using display inline on the list items. Padding right has been added to the A elements to add a little space between them. Have you ever noticed how the navigation item can change on hover or when a nav item is clicked? Government websites will frequently have links load as blue, and then once the user has visited the link, that link changes to purple, signifying that the user has already viewed that link. That is done with the use of pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes can be used to change the appearance of a navigation link. The pseudo-class A:"link is the default state for a hyperlink that has not been clicked or visited. The A:"visited is a link that has been previously visited by the user. Focus is triggered when the hyperlink has keyboard focus. Hover is triggered when the mouse pointer moves over the hyperlink. And active is triggered when the hyperlink is being clicked. In this example, they have changed the color of the font for the various pseudo-classes. In this example, the CSS for the default link state is set to red or #FF0000, so when the page loads, the first "print this page" displays in red. The second image shows how the underline disappears and the font color changes when the link is hovered over. These styles are set through the A:"hover pseudo-class. Your web pages should always have an H1 element in your HTML, so search engines and assistive technologies understand what the page is about. However, there might be times when you may not want the H1 element to display. Perhaps you want a banner image to display instead of the text. The best way to accomplish this is to have an H1 with the company name in the header element. Then, in the CSS, add a background image to the header element and hide the H1 content so it doesn't display. The tricky part comes to hiding the H1 element. If you just use display none, the screen readers won't be able to read it. The safest way to make the H1 element not display is to add the code on this slide to your CSS. Basically, you want to indent the text 100%, set the white space to no wrap, and set the overflow to hidden. It's not important that you understand this, but what is important is that you understand that you can't just do display none on an H1 element. You might want to check out the link on the screen for more information about how text was hidden in the past. We've talked about how normal document flow causes the browser to render the elements in the order that they appear in the HTML source code. When using CSS for page layout, there are situations when you may want more control over the position of the element. The position property configures the type of positioning used when the browser renders the element. The values for the position property are static, fixed, relative, and absolute. Static positioning is the default and causes the browser to render an element in normal document flow. Fixed positioning removes a document from normal flow and keeps the element in a specific place. You might have seen instances when a navigation bar is fixed at the head and does not disappear when you scroll. Relative positioning is used to configure the location of an element relative to where it would otherwise render in normal flow. An absolute position is used to precisely configure the location of an element outside of normal document flow. In this example, with fixed positioning, the navigation stays in the same place when the page is scrolled, rather than scrolling up with the rest of the page. In this example of relative positioning, the location of the paragraph is changed in relation to where it would normally flow. Normally, it would be aligned with the left margin. Absolute positioning precisely specifies the location of an element outside of normal flow in relation to its first parent non-static element. With this example of absolute positioning, this paragraph will always have 200 pixels to the left and 100 pixels above it. This slide has a review of the HTML5 structural elements, the header, nav, main, and footer elements. All of these elements are block-level elements. The header element contains headings of the web page or an area of the document, such as a section or article. The nav element contains the navigation. The main element contains the main page content, and the footer element contains the footer content. There are some new additional HTML5 elements that we have not yet discussed, one of which is the aside. The aside element is a block-level element and is used for information that is tangential to the content. For example, if I'm writing about my recent trip to Disneyland and want to include information about Disneyland in the sidebar, this would be marked up with an aside element. It is tangential, and if it disappeared, the site would still make sense. It is important to note that the fact that aside elements are frequently found in a sidebar is not what makes it an aside element. You choose to use an aside element when the content is tangential. The section element contains a section of a document such as a chapter or topic. If you are writing a website on cooking, you might have a section for appetizers, a section for entrees, and a section for desserts. The article element is used for items that can stand alone on their own. So for example, back to the cooking website just discussed. The individual recipes might be marked up with article elements. The article tag is appropriate for anything that would make sense if it were removed from the original content and placed somewhere else. Some older browsers may not understand that the new HTML5 level elements are block level elements, so it is a wise practice to apply a block setting to the new HTML5 elements. In this example, you can see that the selectors header, main, nav, footer, section, article, figure, fig caption, and aside have all been set to display block. You would want to place this code near the top of your CSS document. And that wraps up the Chapter 6 lecture on page layout. Please be sure to read the chapter thoroughly, as this was just a brief overview of some of the highlights.